The morning of the auction, Josephine carried the first box from the back bedroom to the front hall and set it down too hard. The sound of it filled the house like a small admission of defeat. She straightened up, pressed her palms flat against the thighs of her dark trousers, and looked at the shelf she had just cleared. A pale rectangle of wallpaper where the books had stood for 30 years. She stared at it until her stepmother's voice came from somewhere near the kitchen, clipped and purposeful, telling the hired removal man not to stack the glassware without padding. That was the morning. That was what the auction looked like from the inside. Josephine Foster had answered the advertisement in the community listings. Estate event assistant, day rate, light lifting, and guest logistics. She recognized the address because it was the house she had grown up in. She applied anyway. Dolores had not hired her out of any kindness. Josephine had simply shown up at 7 in the morning with the other day workers, and Dolores had accepted her presence the way she accepted most inconvenient facts, with a thin, composed expression and a deliberate choice not to make a scene where one might be seen. Dolores had been her father's wife for 11 years. Martin Foster had married her quietly, in a ceremony Josephine had attended with genuine goodwill and a borrowed blue dress. She had been 24 then. She had wanted things to go well. They had gone adequately for a while, and then Martin had died in the early part of the previous winter, and adequately had not survived the reading of the will. The library was the part of the estate Josephine cared about. She had said so to the estate attorney in plain language, which the attorney had noted with a carefully neutral expression. The library ran along the full length of the study wall and partway around the corner into the small sitting room. Several hundred volumes, some of them quite old, most of them annotated in her father's close, slanting handwriting. Martin Foster had been a secondary school history teacher for most of his working life, and he had read with the focused patience of a man who expected books to argue back. His marginalia were dense and specific, dates cross-referenced across pages, arguments disputed in a hand that grew more emphatic with age. To Josephine, those annotations were the closest thing to a conversation with him she would ever have again. To Dolores, they were a variable on a liquidation sheet. The estate auction had been scheduled 3 weeks after the funeral. Josephine had raised the library twice in conversations with Dolores, and once in a brief, unsuccessful call to the attorney. Each time the response had been some version of the same measured patience that people use when they are waiting for a smaller person to finish speaking. The library would be offered as part of the household contents. Lot pricing would be at the auctioneer's discretion. The estate needed to be settled. So Josephine had applied for the day rate position, and now she stood in the front hallway of her father's house, carrying a cardboard box, listening to her stepmother direct the arrangement of tea service for bidders. The auction was set to begin at 10. By 8:30, 2 of the hired men were arranging folding chairs in the study. Josephine carried the reserved bidder paddles to the registration table by the front door, sorted them by number, and taped down the edge of the sign-in sheet that kept lifting in the draft from the window. She worked quickly and without conversation, which suited her and seemed to suit Renata Holt as well. Renata was the estate auction coordinator Dolores had engaged for the occasion. She was a woman in her mid-40s who wore her efficiency like a coat she had outgrown slightly at the shoulders, always a degree too formal for the room. She had a clipboard and a headset she did not need for a house this size, but wore anyway. When she had first encountered Josephine on the driveway that morning, she had checked the name on her hired staff list without actually looking up, assigned her a tasks sheet, and moved on. To Renata, Josephine was a function, and functions did not require eye contact. Agnes Beaumont arrived at 9:30. Agnes was 81. Her white hair pinned back with the same kind of tortoiseshell clip she had worn for 40 years. Her coat a navy wool with a small amber brooch at the collar. She had been Martin Foster's neighbour for 3 decades. She had brought casseroles during his illness and shown up without announcing herself, which was how Martin had preferred help and how Agnes had always given it. She paused on the front step, took in the folding chairs visible through the window, and then found Josephine in the front hall and held both her hands for a moment without speaking. That was enough. Agnes had brought the secondary catalogue. Josephine had not known her father kept a secondary catalogue, a handwritten record he had given Agnes for safekeeping at some point in the last year, as though he had known something like this morning was coming. It listed every book in the library by its position on the shelf, rather than alphabetically, with notes about which volumes had been gifts, which he had found in charity shops, which ones he thought Josephine would want to read before she turned 40. Josephine pressed the catalogue flat against her chest for a moment, then folded it into the inside pocket of her jacket. The bidders began arriving at 20 to 10. Josephine showed them to the study, offered the morning tea that sat in a tall thermos on the side table, and answered questions about lot numbering. She answered them correctly and with the same measured courtesy she extended to everyone, which cost her something she did not let show in her face. The man who arrived at 10 past 10 did not look like the kind of person who bought libraries. He was perhaps 38, wearing a dark sweater over a collared shirt, his jaw unshaved in the way of someone who had not bothered rather than someone who had chosen it as a style. He carried no briefcase. He signed in at the registration table with a pen that was not attached to the clipboard, his own pen, capped and replaced in his breast pocket when he was done. He accepted a bidder paddle with a short nod and walked toward the study at the pace of a man who was not hurrying, but was also not interested in the decor. Josephine noticed the pen. She noticed it the way she noticed things she did not have language for yet. The thermos had emptied by then. She went to the kitchen to refill it, and when she returned, the man in the dark sweater was standing near the corner section of shelves where Martin's literature and philosophy ran, holding a copy of something slim and green. He was not reading it. He was looking at the inside cover. Josephine refilled the cups of 2 bidders near the door, moved along the table, and stopped beside him. "More coffee?" she asked. He looked up. He had a way of focusing that was complete, as though attending to a question required all of something. "Please," he said. She poured it. He watched her hands, not in a peculiar way, simply in the way of someone who was paying attention. She topped up the cup and was about to move on when he said, "Do you know if the catalogue for this lot is available?" Josephine set the thermos on the side table. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and laid the catalogue on the shelf in front of him, not giving it to him, simply making it available. "It's handwritten and not organized the way an auctioneer's catalogue normally is," she said. "It goes by shelf position, left to right, top to bottom. If you want to find a specific title, you'd have to scan through." He looked at the catalogue without touching it. "Whose handwriting?" "The owner's," Josephine said. "The original owner." He picked it up then, carefully, with the specific care of someone who understood what he was holding. He did not flip through it. He opened to the first page and read what was there, and whatever he found in those first few lines held his attention for long enough that the room made one small shift around them. The auctioneer's assistant testing a microphone, a bidder asking Renata a question about payment terms, and none of it reached either of them. "He cross-referenced his own notes," the man said quietly, to no one in particular. "He argued with himself in the margins," Josephine said. "He called it a dialogue. He told me once he'd learned more from disagreeing with books than from agreeing with them." The man set the catalogue down on the edge of the shelf, carefully aligned with the wood. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll want to reference this during the bidding," he said. "You can," Josephine said. "Leave it on the shelf when the session ends." She picked up the thermos and moved to the next cluster of bidders. She did not tell him her name. He did not ask. The library lot came up fourth in the session's order. Dolores had arranged for it to go early, presumably to keep the room's attention while it was still fresh. Renata announced the lot in the language of auction logistics. A private residential library, several hundred volumes, offered as a single lot. Viewing completed bids to open at a figure that made one of the other bidders set down her cup. Josephine stood near the doorway with the empty thermos. She kept her face composed. There were two other interested bidders, a woman who collected decorative antique sets and a man who described himself to his companion as a scout for a small private press. Neither of them looked at the books the way the man in the dark sweater had looked at them. Neither of them had read the catalogue. The bidding lasted 6 minutes. The man in the dark sweater sat through the first 3 rounds without lifting his paddle, which was unnerving in a specific way Josephine could not account for. Then he raised it once, at a figure well above what the decorative collector had committed to, and the scout considered it for 30 seconds before settling back in his chair. Renata called the lot. The man in the dark sweater set his paddle on his knee and did not look around the room. Dolores, standing at the edge of the room near the far window, made a small, satisfied adjustment to the bracelet on her wrist. Josephine went to the kitchen. She set the thermos on the counter, pressed both palms flat against the cool tile, and breathed out slowly. She had known it would happen. She had watched it happen with her eyes open, and she had not left the room, which felt like the right choice, even as the floor seemed to shift slightly beneath her feet. She stayed in the kitchen until she could hear the second lot being announced, and then she went back. The session ran until 12:30. Josephine cleared cups, answered questions about parking, and helped 2 bidders carry small furniture lots to their cars. She moved through all of it with the same steady competence she had brought to the morning, and no one treated it as anything other than what they were paying for. Dolores found her in the hallway at 1 o'clock, when the last bidder had left and the hired men were folding chairs. She did not look at Josephine directly. She said, to a middle point in the air between them, that the estate settlement meeting would be held the following Thursday, and that Josephine was welcome to attend if she wished, though Dolores anticipated it would be straightforward. "Your father's wishes were very clear," she said, in a tone that meant the conversation was already over. "I know what his wishes were," Josephine said. Dolores looked at her then. "Of course you do," she said, and moved toward the kitchen. Josephine stayed in the hall for a moment. Agnes came from the sitting room, her coat already buttoned. She touched Josephine's arm once, a brief, steady pressure, and said she would call in the week. Then she let herself out the front door, and the latch clicked behind her. Renata was in the dining room, working through her paperwork on the cleared table. Josephine carried the last of the stack chairs into the back room, passing the dining room twice in the process. The second time, the door stood open enough that she could hear them. Renata was asking something about the distribution schedule, and Dolores said plainly, the way people speak when they believe they are in private, that the distribution was going to be simple because there was only one beneficiary in any practical sense. Josephine, she said, had always had an exaggerated sense of her claim on things. There had never been any documentation of a specific bequest for the library, and without documentation, the attorney had very little to work with. Dolores said the word complication with a specific lightness that made it heavier. She said it in the way of someone who has been thinking about it for a while and has arrived at a position they find quite comfortable. Josephine stood in the hallway with a folded chair under each arm and the dining room door a foot away from her left shoulder. She did not move for the length of time it took Dolores to finish speaking. She heard Renata say something that sounded like agreement, the particular sound of someone who has already decided which side of a thing is worth being on. She carried the chairs to the back room. She stacked them. She put on her jacket, retrieved nothing from the kitchen except her own bag from the hook by the door, and walked the 3 blocks to the bus stop. She did not permit herself to think until she was on the bus, and then she permitted herself one complete consideration of what she had heard. By the time she reached her stop, she had decided to stop contesting. It was the only rational decision and also the most expensive one she had ever made. She lived in a second-floor apartment a mile from the bus line, a small 2-bedroom in a low brick building where she had lived for 6 years. She had been paying rent on it at the same rate for 4 of those years, which had required some arranging, and she was fond of it in the way of someone who has made a place genuinely hers through sustained attention. She had 2 large windows that got afternoon light, a kitchen that required patience with the back burner, and a wall of shelves she had built herself from lumber and pipe brackets over 2 successive weekends. The shelves held perhaps 40 books. The wall was long enough for several hundred. She had always known, without acknowledging it plainly, that she had been building space for her father's library. She spent the 3 days after the auction doing the things that needed doing. She notified the attorney that she would not be pursuing the claim. She called Agnes, who listened without interruption, and then said, "Well, you know best," in the voice of someone who believed the opposite, but understood that trust required leaving people their own decisions. Josephine thanked her. She cleaned the apartment, rearranged the smaller shelf, and returned 2 library books that had been sitting on her nightstand since before the funeral. On the 3rd evening, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to a man she did not recognize, in a delivery service jacket with a cardboard box roughly the size and weight of the kind of thing that would hold 20 hardcover books. He was already setting it down before she reached the door, a practiced set of a practiced man. He handed her an electronic pad for signature, and she looked for a sender name on the receipt. The field read, "Private." She signed. He nodded and went back down the stairs. She took the box inside and opened it with her kitchen scissors. The books were wrapped in craft paper in groups of 5, each group bound with twine. She unwrapped the first group and felt the specific weight of them, the slight give of old spines, the smell that is particular to books that have lived in one house long enough to absorb the character of the rooms. Her father's handwriting was on the spine labels, the small, neat tabs he had pressed to the lower right corner of each spine to identify his from a guest's. She held one for a long moment, then set it carefully on the bare pine of the shelf. She did not know who had sent them. She sat on the floor next to the box for a while, looking at the wall, and then she finished unwrapping and began shelving, using Agnes's catalogue to find the right positions. The second delivery came 2 days later. Another box, this one heavier. Third delivery, 2 days after that. No note with any of them. The signature line always read, "Private." She shelved each batch using the catalogue, and the wall began to fill in the way a sentence fills in when the missing words are returned to it, the shape becoming recognizable, the meaning becoming available. Agnes came on the afternoon of the 3rd delivery. She sat at the kitchen table with tea and looked through at the shelf, and did not say anything for a while. Then she said Martin had been a man who put things in motion without announcing it. "He was not someone who waited to be asked twice," she said. "He's been gone for months, Agnes," Josephine said. "I know that," Agnes said. "I'm not talking about him." She stayed for 2 hours and they talked about other things, about the early spring and the neighbour's fence, and a recipe Agnes had been meaning to write down. When she left, she paused in the doorway and looked at the shelf again. "It's coming back," she said, meaning the library, or meaning something else, and then went down the stairs. The 4th delivery arrived on a Friday evening. The knock was different from the others, less certain, the knock of someone who is not in uniform and not accustomed to arriving unannounced. Josephine opened the door, and the man from the auction, the one in the dark sweater, was standing in the hallway with a box under one arm and the secondary catalogue in his opposite hand. He looked for a moment as though he had arrived and was now assessing the situation from the inside of it, which was not entirely a comfortable position. The box was medium-sized. He was taller than she had registered in the study. "I signed for 3 deliveries before this one," he said, "but I wanted to bring this last one myself." Josephine looked at him. She looked at the catalogue in his hand. "Come in," she said. He set the box on the floor inside the door and straightened up and looked at the shelf the way he had looked at it in the study, with the same complete attention. It was roughly 2/3 full now. She watched him take in the specific order of it, the shelf positions, the spine labels, the annotations visible on the first few volumes in the nearest section. "You used the catalogue," he said. "You sent the catalogue," she said. He looked at her then. "I found it with the last lot, after the session ended." He set it on the table by the door. "I thought you might need it." She had kept her expression even, and she kept it even now, but something in her throat went quiet for a moment. "You bought them," she said. "I bought them," he said. "I can do what I like with what I've bought. That's not why I'm saying it." She was not sure exactly what she meant by that, but it was true. "I'm saying you spent money on someone else's library at an estate auction and then mailed it to a stranger. I used the catalogue to find the address. The catalogue doesn't have my address in it." A pause. Not a guilty one, simply an honest one. "No," he said. "I had some help with that part." She did not ask how. He had the look of a man who was used to being able to find information when he needed it, a look that had nothing to do with carelessness, and everything to do with long practice. She had noticed that, in the study too, the precision with which he moved through a space, as though he had long since stopped wondering whether he could manage a situation, and simply managed it. She made tea. He sat at the kitchen table and they talked, the way 2 people talk when they have decided without stating it to be honest with each other. He asked about the annotations and she told him about her father's method, the date stamps, the cross-references, the running arguments he carried from book to book, as though they were ongoing correspondences. She told him about the history teaching, the 30 years of it, the former students who had sent cards in the winter, and some of whom had written things that she had needed to put down and return to later. He listened in the way he had listened when she told him about the catalogue that morning in the study, fully, without filling the pauses. He asked about 2 titles in particular that he had noticed in the box, a history of the Roman water system and a collected translation of Byzantine administrative texts. And she explained without condescension that her father had been interested in the infrastructure of civilizations, the way empires moved things from place to place, water and grain and money and power. She had read both, she said. He said he had not read either, and something in the way he said it made her believe him entirely. She asked how he had found the auction. He said he had been looking for something to add to a research library he was in the process of building, not a personal one. A library for a small foundation that worked on educational access in rural areas, and that estate sales sometimes turned up the kind of working annotated collections that were more useful for research than clean new editions. He said it without weight, the way people describe the ordinary facts of their work. "A foundation," she said. "The Morrow Foundation," he said. "We're fairly small. We've been operating for about 4 years." She noted the name. She did not yet attach it to anything else. He left at 8:30. At the door, he said, "The last box has everything except one item. I'll have it sent separately." She thanked him. He nodded and went down the stairs, and she stood in the hallway with the door open, listening to his footsteps on the lower landing until they went out the street door. The estate settlement meeting was the following Thursday, held at the attorney's conference room, a room in a converted terrace house with tall windows and a round table that was too large for the number of people gathered at it. Josephine had confirmed her attendance on Monday, which had produced a silence on Dolores's end of the phone that told her the confirmation was unexpected. She had not explained herself. Renata was there as the auction coordinator, completing her formal handover of the session records and the disbursement schedule. Dolores sat with the composed efficiency of a woman who had decided she was about to close something. The attorney, a patient man named Graham, sat with his papers organized into a precise stack. A chair at the end of the table sat unoccupied, which no one addressed, though Renata glanced at it once and then back at her clipboard. Josephine sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing for the first part of the meeting. The attorney went through the asset schedule. When he reached the library lot, he noted that it had been sold at auction and that the proceeds had been disbursed per the estate's instructions. Renata confirmed the sale figure. Dolores looked at a point just past Josephine's shoulder. Then the conference room door opened and a man came in wearing a jacket and a collared shirt with the same unceremonious directness as someone arriving at a meeting he had been invited to attend. He was not the man from the dark sweater. He was younger, efficient-looking, with a leather messenger bag over one shoulder and a mannerism about him that said, "Assistant." He set the bag down on the table and looked at the attorney. "I'm sorry for the delay," he said. "I'm Philip. I'm here on behalf of Caleb Morrow." The name settled into the room. Renata's clipboard lowered. Dolores turned her head toward the door in a movement that had something tightly controlled in it, the beginning of a response she had not yet decided on. Graham looked at Josephine briefly with an expression that was impossible to read and probably cost him some effort. Philip opened the messenger bag and produced a folder which he laid on the table. Mr. Morrow wanted to ensure that the formal record reflected the disposition of the library lot, since the property changed hands again after the auction. He set a secondary document beside the folder. "That's the transfer of title for the entire lot to Josephine Foster, dated the day after the auction. He signed it the same afternoon." Renata said, "I'm sorry, Caleb Morrow as in," and stopped. "As in the Morrow Foundation," Philip said with the specific patience of someone who explains this often. "Yes, he attended the auction personally. He's been involved in several estate acquisitions this year for the Foundation's research library, though this disposition is personal rather than institutional." He looked at Renata steadily. "The transfer is legal. He bought the library, he had title to it, and he transferred it." The room held whatever it held. Dolores said, "I don't see why this requires a formal meeting," in a voice that was trying to recover the procedural high ground from somewhere below it. Graham said, gently and without drama, that since the library lot was now properly documented as having been transferred out of the estate and into Josephine's personal possession, there were also a few other items in the estate's asset schedule he would like to revisit. He opened his own folder. The room tightened. Josephine sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. The meeting, from this point forward, was doing something that required no contribution from her. Renata looked at Dolores once. Dolores looked at the table. The composed efficiency she had carried into the room had developed a kind of fracture that was visible not in any single expression, but in the several small ways she had stopped performing certainty. Her hands folded on the table were doing the small adjusting work of someone who needed to be holding something, and was not. Graham worked through the items patiently, noting several places where the estate's preliminary disbursement schedule had treated discretionary as if it were mandatory, and several others where Josephine's potential claims had been noted and set aside, rather than formally dismissed. He was not dramatic about it. He was the kind of attorney who understood that the precision of language was a form of kindness, when the alternative was ambiguity. Dolores said, at one point, Martin's intentions were quite clear, and Graham said very quietly, your recollection of his intentions, yes. The documentation, which we're working from today, is somewhat more nuanced. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way you say a true thing to someone when saying it kindly is the same as saying it clearly. Renata submitted her auction records and said nothing further. Her clipboard stayed on the table in front of her, no longer consulted. She had the look of someone who has calculated very quickly that the geography of a situation has shifted and that the safest position is stillness. Philip stayed for the meeting's duration, answered 3 specific questions about the library transfer, and declined tea with a brief, courteous word. When the meeting closed, he shook hands with Graham and Josephine both, and then Dolores put out her hand, and he shook it as well, with the same equanimity, and that equanimity was its own kind of comment. Josephine walked home. It was a long walk, longer than the bus would have taken, but she wanted the afternoon, and she wanted to move through it at her own pace. She passed the park where her father had walked in the evenings when she visited. She passed the charity shop where he had found several of the volumes now sitting on her shelf. She walked the whole distance and arrived at her building in the low copper light of early evening, climbed the stairs, and let herself in. The shelf was in the state she had left it, nearly complete, the morning sun's warmth still in the wood even at this hour. She set her bag on the table by the door and stood in the hallway looking at it. Agnes called that evening. She had heard something from someone who had been at a neighbouring table in a coffee shop near the attorney's offices, which was not how Agnes described it. Agnes described it as a general sense that things had moved in the right direction, and then asked Josephine directly whether that was true. Josephine said it was. Agnes said, "Good. Your father would have been very pleased about the library," and then corrected herself slightly. "He would have been pleased that you're keeping it." A pause. "He built it for you, you know. He chose every one of them with you in mind." Josephine sat on the floor of the hallway with her back against the wall and looked at the shelf. She said, "I know." She had not known, or had not let herself know it until recently. They talked for a while longer, and then Agnes said she was going to have her supper and rang off. The knock came the next morning. Not a delivery service knock, not the knock of someone in uniform. A simple, unhurried knock, the knock of someone who has arrived at a door and is prepared for whatever is on the other side. She opened it. He was standing in the hall with a flat package, the kind that would hold a single hardcover, wrapped in the same craft paper as the other deliveries. He had brought it himself again, the way he had brought the last box, and she understood without being told that this was the item he had mentioned at her door the previous Friday. She stepped back and let him in. He handed her the package. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table while he stood near the window with his hands in his pockets. The craft paper came away in 2 careful tears, and she was looking at the annotated catalogue. Not Agnes's secondary copy, which Josephine had been using, but the primary catalogue, the one she had laid on the shelf beside him that morning at the auction, which she had believed was still somewhere in the study of her father's house, or lost, or gone the way the rest of it had almost gone. She ran her thumb along the edge of the cover. Her father had bound it himself, a plain, dark blue cover, with a narrow white label on the spine that read simply, "Foster," in his own handwriting. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the same complete attention he had given things from the beginning, from the moment she had poured his coffee in the study, from the moment he had picked up the catalogue and found the cross-references on the first page. There was nothing performed in the attention. It was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. "You kept it," she said. "From the session," he said. "You told me to leave it on the shelf when the session ended. I took it instead." A pause. "I meant to return it that day." Then I realized it would be more useful as a guide. A guide for the deliveries? Yes. She turned the catalogue over in her hands. You used it to pack them in the right order. Shelf by shelf, he said. Left to right, top to bottom. He looked at the shelf through the open doorway between the kitchen and the main room. You shelved them the same way. She had. She had used Agnes's secondary catalogue to rebuild the shelf in exact order. The positions her father had assigned each volume over 30 years. The history running along the top, the literature on the second register, the slim green philosophy he had read in his chair by the window on the third. The shelf now stood the way the wall in the study had stood. The same sequence, the same patient logic, reconstructed in a room that was hers. She stood up and carried the catalogue to the shelf. She looked for its position, which she knew without checking. Far right on the second shelf, just below eye level, the place her father had always kept his working documents, accessible without reaching. She set it there. The slight sound it made setting against the shelf, that small woodblock contact of cardboard on pine, was so ordinary and so complete that she stood still for a moment to finish hearing it. He came to stand beside her in the doorway. The library filled the wall from the floor to just above both their heads, the afternoon light coming in at an angle across the spines, the pale labels catching it, her father's handwriting running in small, neat repetitions from one end to the other. Several hundred volumes in their proper order, in a room that had been waiting for them for 6 years without knowing it. She was not going to cry. She was going to stand in her hallway in the afternoon light and let the library be there, which it was. "Thank you," she said to the shelf, or to the room, or to the man standing quietly in the doorway beside her. He said, "He did good work with them." She said, "He did." They stood there for a while in the warm, ordinary silence of a room that had what it needed.